You know, if you were an economist back in the 1970s and you told a colleague you were studying international trade, you might have gotten a bit of a funny look. Because the feeling back then was that, well, trade theory was basically a solved problem. It was seen as this beautiful, complete, classical structure, but a finished one, where all the truly interesting work was already in the rearview mirror.
But what if that so-called finished structure had some pretty big cracks in its foundation? What if there were massive, real-world puzzles that it just couldn't solve? Well, today, we're going to dive into Paul Krugman's Nobel lecture and retrace the incredible intellectual journey that completely reshaped how we understand global trade. This is the story of the increasing returns revolution.
So here's our game plan. First, we're going to look at the puzzles that the old classical trade theory just couldn't get its head around. Then, we'll unpack the key ideas, the breakthrough concepts that changed everything. After that, we'll see how this new theory totally nailed modern trade patterns and even explained economic geography. And we'll wrap up with a surprising final twist that makes you wonder which theory is the right one for today's world.
Okay, let's get right into it with Section 1, a finished theories puzzles. Because look, to really get why any big idea is a revolution, you first have to see what was wrong with the old way of thinking. You have to see the cracks in the foundation, those real-world facts that the established theory just couldn't explain away.
The absolute cornerstone of classical trade theory is this elegant, powerful idea: comparative advantage. The logic is simple. Countries trade because they're different from each other. So a country like Argentina, with tons of land and not a lot of people, exports things like beef. Meanwhile, a country like Great Britain, historically, with lots of capital and skilled workers, exported manufactured goods. It's a simple, really powerful explanation for why we trade, and it's all based on exploiting differences.
But then, after World War II, this huge puzzle started to emerge. Economists were looking at the data and noticing that a massive and growing amount of trade was happening between countries that were actually very similar. And they were trading goods that were also very similar. I mean, think about Germany and Japan trading cars with each other, or the US and Canada swapping auto parts back and forth. If the whole point of trade was to take advantage of differences, why on earth was this happening?
And this slide just illustrates that shift perfectly. On the left, you've got British trade back in 1910. It's a textbook picture of comparative advantage. Britain is shipping out manufactured goods and bringing in raw materials. Classic stuff. But then, fast forward to the 1990s, on the right, what's going on? Britain is mostly exporting manufactured goods and importing other manufactured goods. You had countries basically just swapping similar products. This intra-industry trade, as it's called, was something the classical theory was really struggling with.
So the real world just wasn't matching up with the old theory. The puzzles were stacking up. And that brings us to our second section, the breakthrough. To solve these puzzles, economists needed a kind of missing gadget, a new theoretical tool that could finally make sense of it all.
This quote from 1967 really hits on the fundamental roadblock. You see, classical trade theory was built on this assumption of perfect competition, a world with tons of tiny firms where size doesn't give you an advantage. But the real world, with its huge corporations and massive factories, obviously operates on imperfect competition, where economies of scale are everything. The problem was, economists just didn't have the right models to connect that reality to their trade theories. Then, in the late 1970s, the whole picture changed. A series of brand new models of monopolistic competition came onto the scene. Now, they weren't originally designed for trade theory, but economists like Krugman saw them and realized, hey, these are the missing gadgets we've been looking for. They finally gave them a serious, rigorous way to model industries where economies of scale were a big deal. Okay, so the first crucial concept that these new models brought to the table was increasing returns. You probably know it as economies of scale. Think about a car factory, right? The very first car that rolls off the assembly line is unbelievably expensive to make because you have to account for the huge fixed cost of building the factory itself. But the 1,000th car or the millionth? Way cheaper per car. This simple idea creates a powerful incentive for companies to specialize and produce a ton of one thing instead of a little bit of everything.
And the second key piece was the model that could actually handle those increasing returns: monopolistic competition. This framework is perfect for describing markets we see every day, like cars or smartphones or even books. You have lots of firms competing, but each one sells a slightly different version of the product. A Ford Focus isn't a Toyota Corolla, right? They're similar, but not identical. And this setup allows for both product variety and those crucial economies of scale. It was a perfect fit for explaining that similar trade puzzle.
All right, so we've got the new theoretical tools in hand, and that brings us to Section 3, explaining modern trade. Now it's time for the payoff.
Let's look at the killer app, that real-world application that showed just how powerful this new way of thinking really was.
And the perfect test case for all of this was the formation of the European Common Market, what we now know as the EU. As these European countries started to lower trade barriers between each other, a lot of people were, frankly, pretty scared.
See, the old theory, the one based on comparative advantage, it made some pretty scary predictions. It basically said that if you open up trade, entire industries in some countries would just get wiped out. So if Italy was better at making cars, well, tough luck for the entire French car industry. It might just disappear. But the new theory? It predicted something totally different. It suggested that no, France wouldn't stop making cars. It would just start to specialize in a different type of car, like Renault's, while importing other kinds from its neighbors. This leads to specialization within an industry, not the total destruction of it. It becomes more of a win-win exchange of different varieties. So, what actually happened in the real world? Exactly what the new theory predicted. As the economist Bela Balassa pointed out at the time, those fears about entire industries vanishing just didn't come true. Instead, countries specialized within those industries. This was a huge, real-world confirmation that these new models had captured something absolutely essential about modern trade that the old ones had completely missed.
This new theory also managed to prove an old, kinda heretical idea that had been floating around on the edges of economics for years, the home market effect. The argument was pretty simple. Countries tend to end up exporting goods for which they have a really big domestic market. And the logic, based on the new theory, makes perfect sense. Increasing returns push you to put all your production in one place. And to keep your shipping costs down, where are you going to put that one big factory? In the biggest market, of course. Then you can just export from there to all the smaller markets.
But the revolution didn't just stop with trade between countries. Oh no. It turned out that the very same tools, increasing returns and transport costs, were the perfect key for unlocking another field that mainstream economics had mostly ignored: economic geography. Why do industries cluster together? Why is there a Silicon Valley? Why was there a manufacturing belt?
Let's walk through the basic logic here with what Krugman calls a little cheat model. So imagine a company sells its stuff to a big market and a small market. It has two choices. It can build two factories, one in each place, but that comes with a big fixed cost. Or it can build just one big factory and ship its goods to the smaller market, which has a transport cost. Now here's the key. If the fixed cost of building that second factory is bigger than the cost of just shipping the goods, what does the company do? It's a no-brainer. It concentrates all its production in the bigger market and serves the smaller one from there.
Now, just imagine thousands of firms all making that same calculation. When you get the right recipe, big economies of scale, pretty low transport costs like you get with railroads, and production that isn't tied to a specific piece of land like manufacturing is, you create this powerful feedback loop. Firms and workers start to cluster together, which creates a large market, which then attracts even more firms and workers. That self-reinforcing process is exactly how you get an industrial core, like the historic U.S. manufacturing belt.
So these new theories gave us this incredibly rich, powerful way to understand both trade and geography. But here's the final, and maybe the most fascinating twist in the whole story. Krugman argues that right around the time these theories were being perfected, the world itself started to change. And in some weird ways, it started to look a lot more like the world described by the old classical models again. Just take a look at this data on industrial clustering in the United States. You can see that the geographic concentration of manufacturing actually hit its peak way back in the 1930s, and it's been on the decline ever since. The old manufacturing belt has slowly been dissolving as industry spreads out across the country. The very forces of agglomeration that the new theory explains so well seem to be getting weaker, not stronger. And what about international trade itself? Well, check out this chart. It shows the average wage of America's top trading partners compared to the U.S. wage. Back in 1990, it was at 81%, which means the U.S. was mostly trading with other rich, similar countries. But look what happens by 2005. It drops all the way down to 65%. Why? Well, this reflects the huge rise of trade with very different, lower-wage countries like China and Mexico. And trade that's driven by massive differences in wages? That, my friends, is pure, classic comparative advantage making a major comeback.
So let's just recap this whole journey real quick. The elegant classical theory was great, but it couldn't explain why similar countries were trading similar things. The big breakthrough came from applying these new models of increasing returns and monopolistic competition. This new theory gave us a fantastic understanding of intra-industry trade and why industries cluster together. And yet, ironically, the global economy today might actually be shifting back towards patterns that the old classical theory is better at explaining.
And that leaves us with a huge question for today. When you look at the incredibly complex global economy we live in, with its mix of high-tech specialization between rich countries and these vast supply chains stretching to lower-wage countries, which theory gives us the better lens? Is it the classical focus on differences, or the new theory's focus on scale and variety? Which one do you think best explains the trade of tomorrow?